Bhagavatamritam taptivanam kavivaridham kalmashapaham sharavanam Srimadatatadam bhuvivanti bhuriyajana. Your words are bringing life to scorched souls, praised by poets. They are wonderful and exalted. Those who say these words throughout the world are truly given souls. Welcome everyone to our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. We're on the chapter Dakshineshwar, part 1, page 351. And this weekend, Swami Tyagananda from our Boston Center is here, and I requested him, and he very kindly agreed to take the class tonight. So I will turn everything over to him. Please.
Thank you. Can everyone, by mere wish, develop knowledge and love at the same time? It depends on the person. One bamboo is more hollow than another. Is it possible for all to comprehend the nature of God? Can a 1 seer pot hold 5 seers of milk? M. God. Through mere grace, a camel on the eye of a needle. Master. In God's grace, just like that, a beggar may get a penny if he asks for it. But suppose he asks you right off for his train fare. How about that? M stood silent. The master too remained silent. Suddenly he said, "Yes, it is true. Through the grace of God, some may get both Jnana and Bhakti." There are several interesting points here. One is clearly regarding the grace of God. It's one subject that raises a lot of hope, a lot of questions, and a lot of anxiety as well. Where does it come? How does it come? Who can hold so much grace? These are the questions that are addressed and throughout this book in different contexts. One thing that Sri Ramakrishna often referred to is that God's grace is always like it's always going, and we need to hoist our sails to catch the breeze. Because if we think of God's grace as coming selectively, or God giving it to people only when God feels they deserve it, if it's a question of deserving, if it's a question of time, if it's a question of people, it raises all kind of problems. Like we think of the divine as all loving, all kind. So there is clearly one idea as the judge, the stern judge. But the God of grace, the God of love, not a judge. Because again, it's a kind of a thing about love and justice. We want, at one level, we want that the right thing, the good thing should be rewarded. That which is evil, that which is bad, should be punished in some form. While we recognize that principle, we only recognize it when it is somebody else. Something stupid has been done by us, then we don't invoke justice so much. We just invoke then that maybe to God's grace, God will forgive me, God will let it go. And so this question of grace that comes again and again, and that's something that every devotee has to deal with. And the second thing is, of course, this he says that through God's grace, some may get both jnana and bhakti. Well, we kind of get the general sense of it. This also creates sometimes the dichotomy between knowledge and bhakti. In some sense, it has already been created in some minds just by the presence of the four yogas. So we kind of segment pathways, like four pathways, and then it creates different kinds of problems, like which is the yoga that I should follow, which is better, which is easier. Similarly with jnana and bhakti as well. So one way that I have found helpful to think is that while these are good for to some amount of clarity intellectually, I don't think it really matters for a devotee whether to label the path as a path of jnana or a path of bhakti. It really doesn't matter. What matters is, do I have any purpose in life? Do I know what I want? I know where I stand at the moment. And if I know where I stand, and if I have some idea about where I want to go, that's really the point. I mean, essentially, when we look up, what do you say for that map? Yeah, GPS. And olden days, of course, before GPS came, we had paper maps. Understanding may not be perfect, but at least we must know where I am, what do I want in life, and how will I get it, and what will take me there. Again, these answers don't have to be perfect, don't have to be accurate, but at least some amount of thinking, if it has gone into that, then all that we need to do is find a way to go to that goal. It really doesn't matter whether you think of that way as jnana or bhakti. It doesn't matter. If we think about the dominant tendencies of our own mind, if the ability to the feelings are very strong, or the way to reason things out, that's very strong, because people are different. When some people, the power to reason is stronger than some other people who have a greater power to feel. So depending on that, we can find the path that suits us best without necessarily categorizing it as this is bhakti yoga, this is karma yoga. I don't think it's absolutely necessary. And so when Thakur says here that through God's grace one might get both jnana and bhakti, one way to understand that would be, no matter what path we follow, ultimately what a jnani experiences and what a bhakta experience is not really very different. And that's why we read in the books often that jnana and bhakti ultimately meet at that point of realization. M saluted the master and went back to the bale tree. At midday, finding that M had not yet returned, Sri Ramakrishna started toward the bale tree. But on reaching the Panchavati, he met M carrying his prayer carpet and water jug. M saluted the master. Sri Ramakrishna said to M, I was coming to look for you. Because of your delay, I thought you might have scaled the wall and run away. I watched your eyes this morning and felt apprehensive lest you should go away like Narayan Shastri. Then I said to myself, no, he won't run away. He thinks a great deal before doing anything. So Narayan Shastri was a great devotee, a great spiritual seeker who used to visit. And we read elsewhere in the gospel that he developed this sudden spirit of renunciation, and then he just disappeared, and then no one heard from him, I think, after that ever. And so because M did not return, then Sri Ramakrishna felt like, well, you might have done like Narayan Shastri. And and then he said, no, you won't do it because. So this is interesting. So he says, no, you won't do anything like that. You think a great deal before doing anything. You see how something that is positive can also become a negative. Now, thinking a great deal about something, not necessarily bad. I think that's a good thing to not just do anything impulsively. On the other hand, okay, let me put it this way. Um, Sometimes we refer to some people as a great thinker, as if other people don't think. And the reality is, everyone thinks. If you have a mind, the mind cannot stop thinking. The problem is not really not thinking, the problem is how to stop thinking. So, thinking everyone does. So, if thinking is something that everyone does, then who are these great thinkers? How do we distinguish these great thinkers from the fact that, well, everyone thinks? And one way to distinguish that is that people who are recognized as deep thinkers or great thinkers, they do it in a disciplined way. They do it in a systematic way. So they have lots of ideas, but it's not enough to have a lot of ideas. That we should know how all the ideas in our mind are connected. Every thought, every idea, every piece of information that we have is almost like a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. And thinking, analyzing, reflecting is a way of trying to find where each of this piece fits. And a person who has been able to fit all these ideas perfectly, and then a beautiful picture is forms in the mind, and that brings so much joy. And that's essentially what knowledge. It's not just having a lot of ideas. So thinkers are those with whatever ideas they have, they know how those ideas stand in relation to one another. And for the rest of us, most of us, what we do is we read a lot, we hear a lot, we think a lot, we have more ideas than we can deal with. And then, of course, there, and as Swami Vivekananda says on one of the places, that it's not just the amount of ideas running. I don't remember the exact words, uh, like helter skelter, like creating a big chaos in the mind. Um, so he said, when he said told M that you are not something that you're going to do this because you think a lot. That these are the thoughts that come to my mind about thinking. That at some time in life we need to take a decision. Sometimes, even after thinking and arriving at a decision, people don't know when that process has ended. They just want to keep thinking with a little bit of uncertainty about, oh, maybe if I got it right, do I get it wrong? Maybe I missed something. So to remain in that state of that indecisive state for a long time, it actually weakens us. Sometimes it can happen in many young men and women who come to join the order, the monastery. Surely there is the desire to join, to become monks or nuns, and they have thought about it clearly because the question of your life, everybody thinks about what they want to do. But after having determined, we find sometimes people are still hesitant. It's like, am I doing the right thing? What if I make a mistake? So that is the kind of thinking that prevents us from just going ahead and doing it. And so whenever we have to take, in fact, it's not just about joining the order. And let's say you want to buy a big house, and that's a substantial investment, and that's a big commitment. That's a big decision. So clearly, one will do almost some amount of thinking and so on. But even after doing that, I'm sure every one of you must have seen people who are still hesitant. They're like, should I do it or not? I've thought about it. Sometimes I feel I should do it. Sometimes I feel I shouldn't do it. And we remain in that indecisive state, which is extremely weakening. So at some point, we have to come to the conclusion and say yes or no. It doesn't have to be yes necessarily, but say, okay, I've thought about it, yes or no. That that will not weaken us. And that is what Sri Ramakrishna is pointing out here, that probably he noticed in M that tendency to overthink, as sometimes they say. And then we may not do what we should be doing, or we would do what we should not be doing. And so thinking is something that really needs a lot of thinking needs a lot of thinking in some ways. Yeah. So I think one of the things that can help us in reading a book like the Gospel, or Swamiji's complete works, or even Mother's Conversations, is not just about the content, clearly, of course, but if we do it well, it might also teach us how to think well. And so sometimes it's helpful not to read too much at a time. And so this kind of a weekly meeting that we have kind of be very helpful. So we kind of read a little, see what kind of thoughts come to mind, and kind of reflect on it, and then move on. You don't necessarily have to come to a conclusion every time. We don't necessarily have to imagine that, oh, I've just got it perfect. No, we may not. Next time, maybe after a week or 10 days, you read the same passage, and different thoughts might come, different ideas might come, and that's okay. Because if we are growing, if we are evolving, then what we read on a printed page and what gets inside and gets processed will be also very different. There's this an incident I can never forget this, and this happened sometime in late 80s. Swami Ranganathanji Maharaj, who many of you have heard about him or probably met him as well. So he was in Hyderabad that time. I was in Chennai, and so he came to visit us in Chennai. He had a lecture to give in the city. So he reached in the evening, and so as soon as he reached the mutt, and all of us sadhu brahmacharin, we went and offered a pranam to him. And then that time he quoted this. There is one passage in Swamiji's complete works, in that Conversations with the Disciple. I forget which volume it is. I wish I'd done my homework so I could have given you the exact reference. So Swamiji says that, do you think that these children of Ramakrishna were born to sit under trees and light dhuni fires? No, the world will learn from them how to work. And so as we were doing pranam, Maharaj quoted this. He said, what a profound thing. And as always, you're so inspiring when he said these words. And so he said, what a profound thing Swamiji has said. And so which was nice, and we all liked it. And then, so after Arati, he was back in his room. And then I had gone to help him set a few things in his room. And again, he quoted the same passage, exactly the same passage. And again, it was nice, of course. But I had heard it just an hour earlier. And so, okay, so he repeated it. And then after dinner, we had this reading, and all the sadhu brahmacharis gathered. And again, we were sitting, and Maharaj was sitting. And again, he repeated that passage. And okay, sometimes you hear the same passage over and over. And so it was still okay. Then nighttime, after dinner, when he went back to his room, and I escorted him back to his room. And then he again repeated the passage. And this time I couldn't resist myself. I was the only one that did. And so I said to him, I said, Maharaj, since the time you came this evening, this same passage, you have repeated at least 4 or 5 times. And he was quiet for a few seconds. And then he said something which is very profound. So what he said was this. He said, over the years, I have read Swamiji's complete works, like God knows, hundreds of times maybe. But he said, while he was waiting at the Hyderabad airport for this flight, and so he had this book with him, and so he read that passage. And he said, as he read those words, just it was a very different experience. He said, I have read that passage of hundreds of times before, and it didn't affect him the way it affected him when you're sitting at the airport terminal. And he said, what a profound thing Swamiji is saying. The world will learn from these children of Ramakrishna how to work. And so he said it was made such an impact that that thing is kind of going on in my mind. And that's how he kind of kept on repeating that. It was such a great lesson. And the reason none of us can ever say that, oh, we are finished reading the gospel. We can never finish the book. And that's why it's been a lifelong practice of many monks, many devotees, that every day, at least, and I think it's better not to read too much at a time, but just read a little bit from the gospel. Because, as I said, and as we learn from at least this one incident, I'm sure many of you may have heard many other stories similar to this, that every time we read, we may not get the same insight. And if we are evolving, if we are growing, the deeper and deeper layers of meaning in the book might become available to us. And that is all about this thinking, about M and so on. The same night, the master called to M, Rakhal, Latu, Harish, and a few other devotees. Master to M. Some people gave a metaphysical interpretation of the Vrindavan episode of Sri Krishna's life. What do you say about it? M. There's one interesting thing. A lot of times, Sri Ramakrishna would introduce a subject, and definitely he has his own views and thoughts about it. But rather than say what he feels, he'll just say, oh, this is what he said. What do you think about it? What do you think? Kind of to gauge, to see what the reaction is. So M says, there are various opinions. What if there are? That he's talking about the metaphysical interpretation of Krishna's life. You have told us the story of Bhishma Deva's weeping on his bed of arrows because he could not understand anything of God's ways. Again, you have told us that Hanuman used to say, I don't know anything about the day of the week, the position of the stars, and so forth. I only meditate on Rama. Further, you have said to us that in the last analysis, there are two things only, Brahman and its power. You have also said that after the attainment of Brahmajnana, a man realizes these two to be one, the one that has no two. Master, yes, that is true. Your ideal is to reach the goal. You may reach it by going either through a thorny forest or along a good road. It's kind of obvious, but the interesting thing here is which is the thorny forest and which is the good road. And clearly, for bhaktas, devotees will say, well, path of devotion is the good road. This path of knowledge is the thorny forest. And the jnanis might say the opposite. So it's very subjective in some ways. Because that is one of the questions that does come. Although Krishna does say in the Gita that the way of the impersonal is more tough. Klesho adhikataras tesham. There is a greater klesha, greater hurdles, obstacles, pain through that. But on the other hand, there are some other places in the Gita he has said very much just the opposite. Here's one other point that will be interesting to know is that I said earlier about the 4 yogas and not to kind of divide our understanding of spiritual life into like 4 different ways. The reason for that is that okay, I lost my train of thought. We'll continue. I'll get it back. Diverse opinions certainly exist. Nangta used to say, Nangta is Totapuri. In Bengali, Nangta means the naked one. He was a monastic of the Naga Sampradaya, and so he was Thakur used to call Totapuri a Nangta. Nangta used to say that the monks could not be feasted because of the diversity of their views. Monk could not be feasted.
Given feast.
Huh?
They couldn't be given a feast.
Oh, could be given a feast. Ah, in that sense. Right, right. Okay. Once a feast was arranged for the sannyasis. Monks belonging to many sects were invited. Everyone claimed that his sect should be fed first, but no conclusion could be arrived at. At last, they all went away, and the food had to be given to the prostitutes. Yeah, they are the kind of the the privileges and the hierarchies that exist in society. Um, that is one of the things we have to kind of keep in mind, because Sri Ramakrishna used to say that devotees have no castes, devotees have no hierarchies. So if we identify ourselves as devotees, then we have to be very attentive to whether these thoughts about high and low, more privilege, less privilege, whether they exist in our mind. Sometimes they may not exist in a very gross sort of way, but in a subtle kind of way, these kind of hierarchies can exist. Until these completely disappear, we cannot say that we have truly developed love for God. Because on one hand, if we say God is my father, God is my mother, and all are children of God, and how God looks upon everyone equally, then if I have to make my own life God-like, then I must make an effort to see upon everyone equally. And that is what we find in the Gita. Krishna, it's a Janmashtami time, so it's good to remember Krishna as much as possible. The Throughout the Gita, Krishna speaks so much about same-sightedness. Now, same-sightedness doesn't mean that you don't see the distinctions. You see, of course, if you have eyes, you will see the distinction. But the distinction won't matter. Swami Tyagananda once said that, as you know, he was a disciple of Ramakrishna. He came and spent a few years in the West and then returned to India. So once Swami Tyagananda said that throughout his stay in the West, he could not distinguish between a man and a woman. Now, he had a perfect eyesight. It's not that he didn't know who was a man, who was a woman, but that distinction did not matter. So, similarly, as we navigate our life through society, we are going to see diversity. We are going to see ideas about high and low. We are going to see things that we don't like. Sometimes we might get upset by it, and sometimes it'll be good to get upset by some of these things that we find in society. But as far as we are concerned, in our own personal attitudes and approaches, if we see ourselves as true children of Ramakrishna and Mother, then we have to make sure that these hierarchies disappear completely from our head. And so that is a message that comes to us through an incident like this. Otherwise, the food will go bad. We won't be able to eat. Here, eating means just the love. We won't be able to experience the love of God. M. Totapuri was indeed a great soul, master. But Hazra says he was an ordinary man. Hazra is actually is. I'm so happy that Hazra existed, because we need characters like Hazra to provide the contrary view, to kind of play the devil's advocate. Because everything Sri Ramakrishna said and everyone just nodded their head, then we wouldn't learn anything. And so Hazra, and of course, to some extent, Narendra, Swami Vivekananda himself. And actually, Sri Ramakrishna appreciated that people didn't just accept everything just because he was saying it, that they could object, they could say it doesn't make sense. And that's something very helpful, I think. In fact, years ago, there was an article in the Reader's Digest. Does that magazine still exist? Never seen it. Yeah, but and at one time in the 70s and 80s, it was kind of, that was one thing I used to read quite often in India. So there's this one article. It's a short essay, really, written by a person who said that, who was reminiscing about his high school days. And he said when he was in school, there were some of his friends who asked a lot of questions. And some of them may be silly, some of them may be stupid, but they just asked. And there were some others who just kept quiet, no questions, nothing. And some of them had, it's not like they didn't have any questions. They had questions, but they were just too conscious about, oh, should I ask it? What will other people think? Will other people think I'm stupid if I ask this question? So they kind of kept those questions to themselves. And then he is reflecting, remembering his childhood friends, and then he was in contact with many of them in later life. Then he says his observation was that those of his friends who asked questions without worrying about what others might think or how others might react, they are the ones who succeeded in life. They really doing well in life. While others who are very afraid, they kind of kept their questions to themselves and were not doing so well. That's one viewpoint. I'm not saying this is like some perfect this thing, but this is one way of thinking. So if there are any doubts, and so that way Hazra is really great because he wasn't afraid. He just like, I don't agree with this. Or if Sri Ramakrishna said something, he would say something completely contrary, which gives us a chance to hear then Sri Ramakrishna's response. And it's a little bit also like the Gita. Again, going back to Krishna's teaching in the Gita, there is a view that the entire message of Krishna, so to speak, whatever Krishna wanted to teach, is really given in the second chapter of the Gita. Because the second chapter really has all the classical divisions in these ancient texts. In the beginning, of course, with the you know how the second chapter begins. The first chapter is when Arjuna refuses to fight. The second chapter in the beginning, then Krishna urges Arjuna, no, get up, what are you doing? And just kind of blasts him. And then there is a little bit of resistance still from Arjuna, but then finally comes this realization, I'm confused. And then Arjuna says, Karpanya dosho apahata swabhavaha, that the torment that was going on within him, the confusion that was going within him. And then he says, Shishyasteham shadhimam tvam prapannam. I surrender myself to you. Please accept me as your student. It's interesting, up to that point, Krishna has hardly said anything. Until that 11th verse of the second chapter, all that Krishna just speaks only once. In the first chapter, he says, okay, he just takes the chariot in between the two armies and then tells, okay, now look at the people you're going to fight with. That's it. No teaching was given. But only when Arjuna said, I surrender myself to you, and in a very, not in a kind of a, in a very direct way, he says, Shishyasteham, please accept me as your Shishya. Because that is the tradition in Vedanta, that until the student specifically points out the desire to learn, to be a student, the teacher may not begin their teaching. And so after Arjuna makes that request, then Krishna's teaching begins. And in the first part, up to I think verse 39 or 40 in the second chapter, Krishna lays out the nature of the self. So you have the theoretical basis about the path of what the self is. The next half of it, Krishna describes the path. That first thing you need to do is karmanyeva adhikaraste, how the path of selfless activity, you purify your heart. And then he ends by saying, then that's the way to get knowledge. And then finally, that section when Arjuna asks Krishna, but what is the characteristic of a person who has knowledge? And then Krishna gives that what is become well known as the Sthita Prajna Lakshana, the characteristics of the great ones. And this is the general template of many of these old texts. A theoretical presentation of the goal, the truth, then the way, the sadhana of reaching that, and then the falashruti, or what will I get if I reach that knowledge, or what is the characteristics of a Jivan Mukta. So, according to some students of Gita, the Gita really ends with the second chapter. Now, if Arjuna had been the brightest student, had been even Uttamadhikari, the greatest student, he would have said, okay, got it, and that's it. And Gita would have been much smaller, which probably would say, that's so convenient now. It's such a small book. On the other hand, it's good that Arjuna was not the brightest student. Arjuna was average student, like many of us, or probably not. Maybe he was better than us. I think so. We are probably below average, I guess, if we want to be truly honest about it. But still, everything was not clear to Arjuna. And so beginning chapter 3, right till the end of the book, is really an extended question-answer session. You'll find most of the chapters begins with some question of Arjuna. Oh, you said this about Bhakti and Dhyana. You said that. And then Krishna will answer that question. So just as it is helpful that Arjuna asked those questions, which gave chance to Krishna to elaborate on that teaching and gave that benefit to us to understand what was meant in those cryptic teachings given in the second chapter. Exactly in the same way, people like Hazra here in the gospel, and as I said, even Narendra and some others, they are very helpful because the kind of questions they ask help clarify the teachings that are given. Most people actually didn't have too many questions to ask. So one common question that you will find throughout the Kathamrita, through the gospel, people simply say, Mashai, Upai ki. What is the way? That's kind of a very generic question. But then some others asked more specific ones. But Hazra says he was an ordinary man. There is no use in discussing these things. Everyone says that his watch alone gives the correct time. This is something also can be very helpful to all students of Vedanta and especially to all devotees of Ramakrishna. That yes, all of us have our own understanding, which is good. Hold on to that. And as Sri Ramakrishna points out here, never ever think that my understanding is like the perfect understanding. Or if someone thinks differently from me, then there's something wrong with that person. Or that person is wrong. You will see one of the reasons people become fanatical. People want to believe that what they believe is the right thing, and they start criticizing or condemning different ways of thinking, different ways of looking, different ways of worshipping, is at least partly due to a lack of faith in themselves, obviously. It's also lack of faith in their own lack of conviction in what their thoughts are. And this kind of a binary way of thinking that if I am right, then everyone who thinks differently from me is necessarily wrong. Because if someone who thinks differently from me, if that person were somehow right, then there is a danger that I could be wrong. And so in order to not allow that possibility to arise in our mind that somebody else could be right, they go out of their way to condemn and criticize and if necessary, just kind of, if it just ends with condemnation, it can be managed. But we are living in perilous times. I don't want to go on a big rant about gun control. But nowadays, if people feel you don't agree with them, they just don't condemn sitting in their home. They might just go and pull out the guns and you have no right to exist. So, I mean, there is a real problem right there. But that way of doing, that way of thinking does not come from strength. It comes from weakness. So just because one can brandish one's physical strength or power and go and threaten someone and even kill someone or hurt someone, that kind of a like a macho attitude, it comes from weakness. It's not a sign of strength. On the other hand, someone who even in such a threatening situation can hold their peace, can hold their calm, and do the right thing, they are much stronger than someone who just wants to go and do it. And that's what Sri Ramakrishna is pointing out here. That everyone thinks their own watch is right. But the truth is, he said, no one's watch is right. God's watch alone is right. And so, whatever our own understanding about ourselves, understanding about the world, understanding about God may be, which is good. We don't have to second guess it. But two things. First, to recognize that there are many different ways of thinking. So if I'm right, someone else can be right too, equally right. So my being right doesn't necessarily mean everyone else is wrong. Secondly, if I were perfectly right, I would be enlightened. I will be into Nirvikalpa Samadhi. The fact that I haven't entered into Nirvikalpa Samadhi yet means that my thinking is on its way, is evolving. And so while I can cherish my own way of thinking, I can cherish my own understanding, I must let open the possibility that my changing will evolve. My thinking, my understanding will change as I change. And in some ways, it's good that our thoughts change for the better, for because if someone says, I thought exactly in the way 10 years ago, and today I think exactly in the same way, that's not a virtue. It means that nothing, I'm not evolved at all. I was the same person I was 10 years ago. I was the same stupid person I was 10 years ago, and I am the same stupid person now. No. So I think clinging to our ideas, clinging to our thoughts is not really helpful. So treasure them, cherish them, but always leave open the possibility of evolving, growing. And a lot of this can occur by listening to other people, by hearing what others are saying. Because as someone once said, what is the opposite of speaking? And the idea was, well, opposite of speaking is listening. But no, opposite of speaking is not listening. Opposite of speaking, of course, now, of course, all of you are listening, I hope. But you're sitting around a tea table, let's say, or you're having a conversation. When someone is speaking, is everyone really listening? Or at least many are just waiting. So opposite of speaking is waiting, because everyone has thoughts. So he said, when will this person stop? So then I will get to say what I want to say. So very few people in any conversation oftentimes are listening. Everyone is like waiting their turn to speak. But if we want to truly grow, we must practice listening. Speaking is easy. See, I'm just kind of going on and on. That's easy. But sitting there listening with full attention, that's tough. But if only one who has developed this ability to listen, they will they have some chance of growing. Because when we listen to something, we don't have to necessarily allow everything to go inside. We need to have some filter, because there's a lot of nonsense out there. So we don't have to allow it to go inside our head. But once our filters allow these ideas and thoughts to enter inside, then we have a chance to see, compare it with our existing thoughts and ideas. And maybe something new that we hear, a different way of approaching, might help change my way of understanding for the better. I might have greater clarity. And so that is very, very helpful. And that's why when Sri Ramakrishna says everyone thinks their watch is right, uh, it's good to think about our own understanding. And yeah, that's about it. You see, Narayan Shastri, yeah, the same Narayan Shastri who had jumped over the fence and gone. Narayan Shastri developed a spirit of intense renunciation. He was a great scholar. He gave up his wife and went away. A man attains yoga when he completely effaces woman and gold from his mind. With some, the characteristics of the yogi are well marked. I shall have to tell you something of the six centers. The mind of the yogi passes through these and he realizes God through his grace. Have you heard of the six centers? Nowadays, when in Vedanta, when we speak about centers, you're like, oh, Boston Center and this center. Well, these are different centers, obviously, you know. These are the seven planes of the Vedanta. Sometimes M also, because he was a teacher and kind of quite a learned person in his own ways, you will see his comments are not, he's not always asking question. He's like, I'm adding something to the conversation. So when Sri Ramakrishna says, have you heard of the six centers? M says, these are the seven planes of Vedanta. And then Master corrects him, not the Vedanta, but the Vedas. Do you know what the six centers are like? They are the lotuses in the subtle body. These are the yogic symbols that are used, and every center is considered a lotus. And it's very elaborate, as some of you who may have read about this know. A part of it is also um, those who do ritualistic worship. And so there is one ritual called the Bhuta Shuddhi. And there is a big, if you do the elaborate Bhuta Shuddhi, then there is a very big meditation involved with all these six centers. And Sri Ramakrishna has discussed in some parts in the books of yoga, you might get some details of every center. The color of the lotus is different, the number of petals are different, and how they bloom and so on. So it's very interesting. They are the lotuses in the subtle body. Again, it's a symbol. Don't go on looking for a lotus there. It's like people sometimes think that, I mean, Kundalini, a snake. A snake is a symbol. But some people take it too literally. They really think that there is some like snake-like thing which goes up. I'll tell you one incident. So we had I was in Chennai for many years before coming to Boston. So we had a devotee, a very long-standing devotee, and his younger brother. They were both quite elderly, and the younger brother had also retired, and so he didn't come to the center all that often, but used to come occasionally. So he once attended a retreat given in Mount Abu in India by this Brahm, Brahma Kumari group. Yes, and so one of their principal methods is the Raja Yoga and Kundalini. So there is a lot more talk of Kundalini there than you might hear in any generic Vedanta center. So anyway, so he went and spent. It's a pretty long retreat, a month. He stayed there and did a lot of Kundalini stuff. So when he came back and he came to visit our center, and he was a very simple person, and some of us rolled our eyes to some of the things he said. But so I asked him, I said, so I heard you had gone to Mount Abu for the retreat. How was it? And he started describing. And this is true. I'm not making it up. So he said they taught them how to meditate and about the kunda, how the kunda. I don't know the detail, but some meditation and how the kundalini will rise. So he said he was sitting in his room that was given to him, and one day sitting and meditating the way they had taught him. And he said he actually felt the kundalini rise. And so the kundalini was rising, and of course he was very happy because he was feeling that sensation of the kundalini, the snake, kind of going up. And so it came to these different centers. And I mean, generally the book say it goes to this 1,000 petal lotus here, and then you enter into samadhi. So he's just kind of waiting for that snake to kind of go here. So he said while he's watching the movement, feeling happy, he just goes up here, and the kundalini didn't stop here. It kind of went out. He said. So he was like scared. Like, where did this kundalini go? So he said, I'm not making it up. This is true. So he just kind of, he said, I just looked up like this. And there were this, in India, they have these ceiling fans. So I don't know what he saw. He said he found this kundalini suspended from the ceiling fan. Now, no idea what he had seen. And clearly, he was not a realized soul when I spoke with them about this. So again, I just mentioned this to show that the symbols are helpful, but sometimes if you don't understand the language of symbols, it can create some kind of a confusion like this. And so whether it's the kundalini or whether it's the lotuses, just remember that these are only symbols. They are essentially different centers of consciousness in different parts in the body.
He was not confused, Maharaj. He saw it.
Huh?
He was not confused. He saw it there.
Well, we are seeing the world too. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Do you know what the six centers are like? They are the lotuses in a subtle body. The yogis see them. They are like the fruits and leaves of a wax tree. Again, a different image to hold in the heart. M. Yes, sir. The yogis can perceive them. I have read that there is a kind of glass through which a tiny object looks very big. A magnifying glass, I guess. Likewise, through yoga, one can see those subtle lotuses. What is the time? Yeah, 7 minutes. Okay. Do you have any? I'm just kind of going on and on and on. Do you have any questions, any comments, anything before we? This is like kind of a new section is starting. If you have anything, it doesn't have to be a question. It could be a complete comment. Okay. Otherwise, I'm going to read more. All right. Following Sri Ramakrishna's direction, M spent the night in the hut at the Panchavati. In the early hours of the morning, he was singing alone. I am without the least benefit of prayer and austerity, O Lord. I am the lowliest of the lowly. Make me pure with thy hallowed touch. One by one, I pass my days in hope of reaching thy lotus feet, but thee, alas, I have not found. Suddenly, M glanced toward the window and saw the master standing there. Sri Ramakrishna's eyes became heavy with tears as M sang the line, I am the lowliest of the lowly. Make me pure with thy hallowed touch. M sang again, I shall put on the ochre robe and earrings made of conch shell. Thus, in the garb of a yogini, from place to place, I shall wander till I have found my cruel Hari. M saw that the master was walking with Rakhal. We don't know really. I don't know. Does anyone know how good a singer M was? Do we know anything about it?
I think they say he had a nice voice, high and didn't sing very loudly or anything. But I think he had a good thing.
Yeah, well, that's good.
Encouraged them to sing.
Yeah, well, That's good. That's good that he could sing well. But I think Sri Ramakrishna's obviously he loved everything about Narendra, of course, but especially singing. So he said when Narendra sings, Thakur could go into samadhi so often. In fact, isn't there one Sanskrit verse which says, mm, Naham tishtami vaikunthe? Remember the verse?
Yeah. I just did it the other day.
Um, Bhaktanam
Where my name is sung.
Sang, yes, yeah. So I'm not in
I don't
Vaikuntha,
even
I'm
go
not
into
anywhere.
the heart of the devotee.
Yeah.
Where
So
my name is
how
sung.
so how music is um, truly a universal language. How sometimes the words we may not understand, but the music has a way of crossing all language barriers and touching us at a deeper level. And therefore we have lots of these songs. You want to say
I was
something?
going to say, Sri Hanuman would say, wherever Ram's name is sung, that's where I want to be, with tears coming down my face.
Absolutely. That's so true. That's so true. And that's what I think we need to find creative ways to be with God. Because I mean, one of the benefits of having a spiritual community like this is that we get to spend at least a part of our time, a part of our life with people who share our ideals, share our thoughts. And many of us will have observed that when you visit a Vedanta center, when you go to a temple, it's easier to meditate, it's easier to pray. You just kind of feel good, you feel replenished, you feel renewed when we go back home. And all of us may not have that privilege to have a supportive community all 24 hours a day. And that's one of the challenges in spiritual life. It's so much easier. It's like this, that if you see yourself as a devotee, or if you are see yourself as the spirit or the Atman, um, it becomes so much easier if people around you look upon you as a devotee or as a child of God or as the Atman. Then you have this kind of an external support, because how we speak, how we deal with other people is completely conditioned by how we see them. And so if and you can see that true with regard to us as well. If we consciously try to think of everyone as a child of the Holy Mother, and if we truly love Holy Mother, it will be impossible to be nasty to anyone. It's really impossible to get angry with anyone. Because how can I be angry with the child of Holy Mother? But we don't remember that always. And so our attitudes, our words, our actions, our thinking is so much conditioned by how we see others. And other people's attitudes and the way they treat us depends on how they see us. Now, in a spiritual community, at least there is a chance that a relatively larger number of people will be supportive of our self identity. But that's not the case when you just go out, when you go to your workplace, when you go to a market. It's not like everyone's saying, oh, yeah, the Atman has come to buy some vegetables. No, nobody's thinking. So that's the challenge that we read in Vedanta, we read in the gospel, you are a divine being. And you go out and everyone looks upon you just as a human being. So the world is not supportive of my self identity, because everyone looks upon you as a human being, treats you like a human being, and in your mind you're like, no, I'm a divine being. And it's tough. And so we need to find creative ways to overcome this barrier. And that's why, as you said, as Hanuman, wherever Rama's name is sung, Hanuman says, I am present there. So exactly in the same way, if we find creative ways of feeling the presence of our own Ishta, or whichever aspect of the divine that is dear to us, everywhere, or at least in as many places as possible, then we have a chance to remain in their presence, even when we are not inside the shrine. For instance, when you're taking a walk and there is this cool breeze, not much chance in the summer, but suppose you're lucky enough to have some cool breeze go by. Well, if you are having a creative imagination, you can think about, oh, just like a mother would lightly touch her baby with love. And you feel when a mother touches the baby, when with great affection, you feel good, you feel energized. So when you feel this breeze kind of just touching you like this, and you feel good about it, nothing stops you from thinking, oh, it's this invisible hand of Holy Mother coming and blessing me. This could be just your own subjective imagination, but this gives you a chance to think of the Holy Mother when nobody around you is thinking about her. So this way, we need to find ways to consciously think of our spiritual ideal, so that spiritual practice doesn't remain limited only to a little bit of japa in the morning and a little bit of japa in the evening. So there are, this, as you all know, the gospel is a big book. It's like a big ocean of ideas, and no matter where you dip into it, some valuable treasures will come. So we'll stop the reading for today, and I'm grateful to Swami Atmagyananandji for giving me a chance to sit at this place where he normally sits and share a few thoughts. Thank you, Maharaj. Okay, I'll do the closing prayer. Okay. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Paramesha Midyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamaha. Om. We bow our heads before Sri Ramakrishna, who is stainless, of infinite nature, whose heart melts in sympathy for his devotees, who is an embodiment of the divine and the Supreme Lord, and ever worthy of our worship. Om. Peace, peace, peace. Exact. All right. Thank you.